Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us here on Ask the Agronomist. We're experimenting with the lighting in the room here today. Looks pretty good on my screen, other than the fat agronomist. Let us know in the chat if you like this lighting better. We've had some comments that there's been a glare, so we literally just turned off the lights here in the conference room at Nutrien and Macomb. Thanks to them for letting us use their conference room again. And opened up the blinds, and we've got some good natural light coming in. So hopefully the lighting is good. I've got my list of notes that you probably can't read, but that's okay because it's my list behind me on the screen. And Adam says lighting looks good on his end too, so that's good. So we'll try doing this in the dark in the future, and hopefully that'll be a little better lighting for those of you that are watching online. As a reminder, if you want to chat in your questions, which we always encourage, be logged in on either your YouTube account or a Gmail account to be able to chat in your live questions. We've got some things prepared to talk about here this morning, but as always, we would much rather answer your questions. I know everybody's going to be super busy today, kind of expecting a light crowd this morning. We have a lot of people that like to watch after the fact, watch the recording. So we'll see how many questions, what kind of attendance we have here this morning. But I know everybody is busy. I barely made it this morning. It was after 1 last night when I finally got a shower and got to bed and parked the planter. So I'm running on about 3 hours sleep this morning. So if the content seems a little sketchy this morning, we'll blame it on that. But thanks everybody for being with us this morning, and we'll go ahead and kick off with some of the questions that Adam and I have been getting through the week, and obviously a lot of conversations around stand establishment. There are a handful of what I would call voodoo days that have surfaced already, which is always the case. I don't think there will ever be a year that there doesn't end up being at least 1 or 2 days that were bad days to plant. And within DeKalb, we're actually doing some work to try to predict those days and try to do some modeling around that. And I don't know that we'll ever be to the point where we're sending out alerts saying don't plant anything today. But in hindsight, we can usually look back and see why those days were bad days. This year, for me, I would say May 2nd has been a bad day. In some cases, the last couple of days of April, the first couple of days of May, that window there has probably been the most challenging so far. Now there is a small pocket in my territory that actually where some of my farm ground is, that caught 4.5 inches of rain in 40 minutes last Friday. So a day or two before that is probably going to turn into a bad planting date as well, just due to that freak rainstorm. So I did have a question from a viewer wanting to know the impact of 4.5 inches of rain in 40 minutes on freshly planted fields, and it's not good, which he already knew that. But we might visit about that a little bit as well. So just driving to Macomb this morning, beautiful morning, sun was coming up, and it was, I love looking at fields in the spring. You can row the crops, and with the sunlight and the lighting, it's just beautiful. I actually had to call a guy this morning. He's doing some strip till soybeans, which I'm very intrigued by. And those strip till soybeans were just absolutely beautiful this morning coming into Macomb. But the planting dates that have been probably the biggest challenge for us have been in that the last day or two of April, first couple of days of May. Things that went in earlier than that look really good. I think a lot of the stuff that was planted last week should be really good. In some areas, people didn't plant much in that late April, early May window. In other areas, that was the first chance they had to get started, and people hit it pretty hard. There's been some stuff that got hoed. There's been things that probably should have been hoed that weren't. I don't mind a rotary hoe myself. I know some people are kind of opposed to that. Nobody wants to do it. It's a pain in the butt. Hoe's always buried in the back of the shed because you're hoping you never have to get it out. I talked to one guy, and he said, well, yeah, he said, we got time to do it, but it'll take half a day to get it out of the shed. And so That's not anybody's favorite practice to do, and you get the maximum benefit from it when you do it when it's just almost too wet to be in the field. What typically happens is we hope we don't have to. We hope we don't have to keep putting it off. We find other things to do. By the time we decide that, oh, damn, I guess I'm going to have to hoe, it should have been done about 3 days before that, and you don't get a lot of benefit out of it because that soil is just too dry, too hard. You don't get a lot of penetration. In some cases, a hoe is designed primarily for work ground. They're not as effective in a no-till field. Generally speaking, if a field just gets hard, and I think you probably know what I'm talking about, it's not really a crust. It's just kind of set up like concrete. That's not really what a hoe is designed for either. If you've got a true crust, that's what a hoe does the best job of. There have been guys, and this can be very effective, take their planter out and set it on a very shallow setting. So where your disc openers are only about a half an inch below your gauge wheels. And if you've got spike closing wheels, it's even better, and run the planter right down the row. It can be, especially in a no-till or strip-till situation, generally a lot more effective than a hoe. But again, if you're not done planting, my coaching to people is, if you're not done planting the first time, I think your time is better spent finishing planting than it is trying to fix a mess. Sometimes catch a rain and the mess will fix itself. Some messes can't be fixed. And I think the best use of your time is to get everything planted the first time first. And then we'll look at, what do we need to do from a replant standpoint, or is there something we need to do to help this stuff out of the ground? We've got some forecast chances of rain coming up here towards the weekend. Some people have already caught a shower this week. A well-timed shower will generally do wonders for getting crop out of the ground. If you are wondering if something is going to make it out of the ground, we'll talk about that a little bit. Start with soybeans first. I never give up on a soybean until it has broken its neck. I don't care how bent over it is. I don't care how swollen the neck is. I don't care how white, yellow, purple, as long as it's not brown, mushy, rotten, or broken, soybeans have a chance. People give up on soybeans way too early. Oftentimes, time and time again, I see somebody that, replants a field of beans, and then, the combination of dragging the planter through the field does a pretty good job releasing some of those first planted soybeans. And a lot of them were probably going to make it anyway. And then you end up with like a stand and 3/4. And, you would have had enough of that initial stand that the replant would not have been required. We don't tell people you can't replant. That's your decision. You're the customer. We have replant programs, replant policies. There is nothing in that policy that says just because Lance said it didn't need to be replanted, that voids your replant guarantee. It does not. But I do think, especially in the case of soybeans, we replant a lot of fields every year that all that replanting is doing is making you feel better and making the field green up faster. It's probably not adding any yield to that field. I've had a lot of people ask me what's the minimum soybean population I would be comfortable with. My figure is 70,000. You can probably go lower than that. So at 70,000, we've got some cushion built in. There's a lot of data out there that shows, down to 60,000, and in some cases even lower, still getting full yield out of soybeans. Now, I know that's not the population you wanted. If you wanted 70, you would have planted 80, not 140. I get that. So when you plant 140 and you get 70 or 80, that's discouraging. It's frustrating. You feel like you wasted money on seed. Some people wish they would have planted thicker the first time. I'm not a fan of over planting soybeans just for insurance against replanting. Typically, when you get into a replant situation, you're losing half or more of the seeds that you planted. And unless you planted 200,000 the first time, you're probably still not going to be satisfied with your final stand. So I think you're a lot better off to plant what you want, replant when you have to. Don't plant 25% more than you want. thinking that will, keep you from needing to replant, because in many cases, if replant's required, even with that 25% extra that you're putting out there, you're still going to replant. So you're really just wasting money on seed on that 25% extra that you're putting out. So Adam, stop me if we get any questions coming through. We've talked about soybeans a little bit.
Maybe before we get into replant, we don't have a question that came in, but have this question come up year over year, especially the last few years with some of the weather patterns we've been having. At what point in time do we need to start considering upping our population?
Yeah, good question. Yep. So we talk a lot about getting soybean seeding rates down, and soybean seeding rates have come down significantly in the last 10 years. Some of that's due to seed treatments. Some of that's due to, more research showing that we've always been overplanting beans. Some of it is, we don't need 200,000 plants for weed control anymore like we used to 20 years ago. So soybean seeding rates have been trending down. It's true that as it gets late, you do at some point need to start increasing your seeding rate in soybeans. That's because that plant's going to be smaller when it's planted late. It's going to have fewer main stem nodes, and those main stem nodes is where the majority of your yield is coming from. So because it's going to be smaller vegetatively due to late planting and have fewer main stem nodes, we do need to start bumping those populations. Now, agronomists will agree to disagree on this. I probably start increasing seeding rates later than a lot of my peers do. In my opinion, you don't even need to consider increasing your seeding rate until we're into the month of June. So to me, 20th of May you wanted it to be 20th of April, but just a few years ago, 20th of May would have been the ideal time to plant soybeans. So 20th of May is only late because we've got guys planting beans in March. The 20th of May isn't late enough that you need to be increasing your seeding rate. So I personally would say, somewhere towards the end of the first week of June is when I start increasing soybean seeding rates, and I bump them about 10% per week as you go through the month of June. And as you get closer to July, you need to be more in that double crop seeding rate frame of mind. And, if you're increasing 10% per week and you're adding, say, 15,000 seeds per week, you go through 4 weeks of June, 15,000 a week, you're adding 60 to 140, you're up at that 200-ish figure. And when you get into true double crop, basically as thick as you can afford to plant them is probably the optimum seeding rate. So you can't really get, double crop beans planted too thick. And I'm going to go from, the 120, 130, 140 that you consider normal through the month of June, up closer to that 200,000 by the 1st of July, and about 10% a week through the month of June will get you, in a good spot there. So I want to talk a little bit on doing stand counts. So with soybeans, I'm going to give you a little trick. If you can't use a hula hoop because they're not the right size. If you make I believe it's like 28.3 inches is exactly the figure. But if you do a little, I should have had Adam doing my math for me. If you make a hoop out of number 9 wire or whatever, I actually took you can take a hula hoop apart and cut it down and put it back together. So I actually took a hula hoop and made the inside 28.3 inches. I'm going to double check my math here real quick. This is pretty exciting TV doing math on my phone. But 28.3 inches pi r squared, right? Area of a circle. So divided by 2 for the radius times 14.15 times 3.14. Oh, shoot, that's in inches. I got to do it in feet. What you're trying to do here is figure out the square footage within that circle. And I actually believe that 28.3 is correct. And what that gives you is 1/10,000 of an acre. An acre is 43,560 square feet. So I believe the inside area of a 28.3 inch diameter circle is 4.356 square feet. The reason that's magical is it makes everything else easy. So if you've got a bean here, a bean here, a bean here, a bean here, bean over here, bean here, and a bean down here, when you throw that hoop. Now, hoops really only work good in drilled beans. We'll talk about 15-inch row and 30-inch row beans in a minute. So I don't recommend using this hoop in 15-inch row beans because you gotta place it too intentionally to catch two 15-inch rows or three in that hoop. Well, you can't catch three. Well, no, you could catch three. No, you can't either, because 3 rows would take 30 inches. Mm-hmm. So you can only get 2. And you got to place it just right to make sure you're getting 2. And when you got to place it just right, your eye is going to play tricks on you, and you're going to put it in a thin spot or put it in a thick spot. You're not placing it randomly enough. So if you're not drilling beans, which most of you aren't, this was a lot cooler when there were drilled beans. But the reason you want to figure out you want to have a circle that's 4.356 square feet is then all you got to do is count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 beans. Get 7 beans in that hoop. That's 70,000 plants per acre. So it makes the math easy. But most of you are not drilling beans. Neither am I. Drilled beans for a lot of years, but don't anymore. So let's talk about 15-inch rows. Let's start with 30s, actually. So if you do the math, 8 seeds per foot in 30-inch rows is about 140. Therefore, we can say that 4 seeds per foot in 15-inch rows is about 140. And if I said 70 was enough, what you're looking for is 2 seeds per foot in 15-inch rows. That's 70,000. Now, if you've never seen 2 seeds per foot in 15-inch row no-till beans, I'll tell you, they look like hell. 70,000 when they're small, 15-inch rows, heavy residue. It doesn't look like there's any way possible that's enough plants, but there's a lot of data to support that it is. If you want to thicken up 70,000, you can do that. I would urge you to be careful, because typically in that field with 70,000, there's a spot over here that's got 120. And if you set your planter on, say, 80, because you want to thicken up 70, and then you thicken up 120, you got a little bit too much of a good thing going on there. So I really, really, really encourage you to be bold, be brave. And if the thin spots in your soybean fields are only down to 70,000, even the thin spot, you've got enough beans. So you really don't need, even if you had if you got an average of 70, well, then we probably need to consider some replant, because if you're averaging 70, you probably got some 30 and 40 out there that need some more plants. But if your thin spots are 70, we can let that field go. It'll be just fine. So that's how you do soybean stand counts. What I would recommend in 15-inch rows is take a tape measure, lay out 5 feet, count all the beans in 5 feet a row, divide by 5, figure out what the average beans per foot is. So if you count, 10 beans in per 5 feet, that's going to be 2 per foot. And that's what you're looking for in a 15 to get to that 70,000. So 70,000 is kind of my it's enough number, regardless of what your row spacing is. So if you've got drilled beans at 70,000, if you've got 15-inch row beans at 70,000, if you've got 30-inch row beans at 70,000, that is enough. It's not as much as you wanted. It's not as much as you'd like to have, but there's a lot of data to support that you're really not going to increase your yield potential by thickening up a stand of 70,000 plants. Now, they need to be at least halfway uniformly spaced. You don't want huge, big gaps out there, and areas the size of that hoop we were talking about or bigger where there's nothing. So they need to be, spaced out well enough that they will fill in. You can keep 70,000 clean. You get much below that, weed control really starts to be a challenge. And depending on what your herbicide program is, depending on what kind of beans you're growing, depending on your flexibility to use dicamba post and those sort of things, may impact how clean you can keep those thin beans. My colleague Chris Carlisle, he did a seeding rate study in soybeans one time at Auburn, and I think these were in 30-inch rows. He went down to 40,000 and that's not the final stand. That was the seed drop, and I think they made 83. Now there were beans in that population study at higher populations that were in the low 90s, so there was a yield hit to being down as low as 40,000, but it's always been pretty impressive to me that 40,000 soybean plants, that's close to a corn population, can make 83 bushel beans. Okay, so let's talk about corn a little bit. So obviously we know that stand establishment's critical in corn. We want it to be uniform. We want that good high seeding rate. When you plant 35 or 36 or 38,000, nobody feels good about getting 29 or 30 or 31 out of a 36,000 drop. When you see that, that means you've got missing plants. You've probably got buggy whip plants. You've got plants that leafed out underground. You've got plants that are delayed emergers and runts. And that's what I'm looking at in some of those voodoo planting dates around late April, early May. We've got stands that are, it's not a disaster, but it's pretty marginal. And we've obviously got, a lot of potential with the commodity prices that we've got. And that has some people being very aggressive on what they want to replant. So, I would say under 26, I'm going to be a pretty aggressive replanter. Over 30, I'm going to be a very aggressive, leave it alone. In that 26 to 30 range that's a gray area. You can take out your Purdue field guide. So we give out a lot of these. If you don't have one of these, I'm kind of old school. You can Google everything that's in the Purdue field guide, but I just like having the book in my hand. That's just me. But they're all the population charts, planting date studies. A lot of this stuff has been redone fairly recently just to make sure that it's still valid. There is a wealth of information in this little book, but there's charts in here that show you if you've got 26,000 planted May 1st and you're comparing that to, let's say, in theory, we always think our replant's going to be perfect, right? So let's say we get a perfect 35,000 planted May 20th. How does the yield potential of 26,000 May 1st compare to 35,000 May 20th? And if you can't, at least on paper, show that you're increasing your yield potential, I don't know what the point of replanting would be at that point. Now, there are guys that think these charts are too conservative, that think these charts penalize late planting too much. And we have had several years in a row here where late planted corn has done very, very well. We had corn in 2019 planted the 10th of June that made 220. So we've had some years here recently where late planted corn has probably been better than we should expect late planted corn to be. So I guess just be a little cautious, being overly optimistic on what your, late May, early June planted corn can accomplish. And before you go ripping up the 28,000 from your April planting, make sure that at least on paper, you're gaining yield potential by making that decision to replant. I know a lot of crop insurance, acres get paid for replant. You can get paid for replant from federal crop. You can get paid to replant from your crop hail. A lot of seed companies offer free or steeply discounted seed for replant. So, hey, technically I'm making money by replanting, but that's not something that anybody looks forward to doing, and not something that we need to do in every case. But there are some acres out there this year that probably going to need replant. I've probably got some of my own where we had that 4.5 inch beaten rain. It was like Mother Nature was pouring rain out of a 5-gallon bucket, and there were lots of them. And that there's seed that's buried underneath, 8 inches of silt. Where the 8 inches of silt came from, the seed got washed out of the ground. There's places that ponded. There's going to be a hell of a crust on some of that, depending on how things dry out after that rain, and do we get additional rain on it. So there's always acres out there. It could have been absolutely perfect when you planted it. You didn't do a darn thing wrong. There's nothing wrong with your seed. But if you get the wrong rain at the wrong time and the wrong intensity and the wrong weather after planting, sometimes what looked like a good idea at the time ends up being a bad idea. We talked about stand counts in soybeans. I want to talk a little bit about my favorite way to do stand counts in corn. So you probably know that for 30-inch rows, 17 feet 4 inches is 1/10,000th of an acre. That's for a 30-inch row. I always have to do some math on other row spacings. I remember 30s, and I know that for my, can't get my clod hopper up that high. Oh, there. For my shoes, 16. If I put heel to toe, heel to toe, heel to toe, walk down the row, 16 of my shoes is pretty close to 17 feet 4. So that's something you should know, just in case you don't have tape measure with you. Know how many of your shoes it takes to get 17 feet 4 inches. That's not the way I like to do stand counts, but that's the quick and dirty, easy way to do it. A better way to do it is to have a measuring wheel. So if you take a measuring wheel, zero it. I need to get a new one because about half the time I zero mine, I start walking, it's not counting. And I get done counting, I get down to where I stop, still says 0. So, damn, I'll do that again. So you got to punch the button really hard to get the counter to work. So I need to get Bear to buy me a new measuring wheel. So I've got my measuring wheel with me all the time. And the thing I don't like about 17 feet 4 inches is it's too short. It is too easy to get a bad spot or a good spot in 17 feet 4 inches. Now, if you're doing the 17 feet 4 inch method, I would recommend just make a mark. 1 minute, Adam. Make a mark. Count down your 17/4. So you're going to have a row here, a row here. Count down this row. Count back that row. Average the two. If you're going to do that method. Question, Adam?
No, not a question. I was just going to say, I think it's 7. Not to be a stickler on the detail. I think it's 17.4 feet.
Oh, yes. I think you're right.
It's actually 17 feet 5 inches.
There you go.
Sorry to be a little, little fact checker.
Yep. I stand corrected. You are absolutely right. So we're at 17.4 feet,
which would be 17 feet 5 inches.
That 0.4 is close to 5 inches.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll say 17 feet 5 inches.
You're getting just details.
Still 16 of my shoes.
Yeah.
So, but the measuring wheel method is a better way to do it. So what you want to do, there is some math required with this. There are some conversion factors that you can memorize or write down based on counting 150 plants or based on counting 200 plants or based on counting 100 plants. If you learn how to do it mathematically, which is my preference, you can count any number of plants you want and then just do the math. And I don't like trying to remember conversion factors. So when I was in high school math, I looked for the shortcut, easy way to do stuff because I didn't want to understand what I was doing. But the way I'm going to explain this to you, it requires you to understand what you're doing because I'm not going to tell you the shortcut, easy way to do it. So if you count 100 plants, I would say somewhere between 100 and 200 would be a good count. You don't want to go more than 200 because you'll just, that's too much counting. And you want to do this more than one spot. So just know how many plants you're going to count. You start walking with your measuring wheel, and every plant that you think is a good plant, count it. Now, we'll talk in a minute about what is a good plant.
Good question.
Get that question a lot too. So let's say you go 58 feet to get to 100 plants that you think are good. So I'm going to get my calculator back out, and we are in 30-inch rows in this example. So a 30-inch row is what? 30 inches is how many feet? 2.5, I think. 2.5 feet. So if you went 58 feet in 30-inch rows, you just counted the plants in 145 square feet. 145 square feet divided by 43,560. This is going to give you a really small number. 0.00329. That's the percent of an acre that you just counted. So all you got to do is divide the number of plants you counted, in this case 100, by 0.00329. 30,395 plants per acre. And you can do that for any row spacing easily. You can do that for any number of plants you want to count. All you got to remember is you calculate the area that you just counted, divide that by the square feet in an acre, and then divide the number of plants you counted by that really small number, percentage of an acre that you just counted. That is the best way to do stand counts in corn. Can't do it that way in beans because too hard to count. Soybeans, you need to calculate, average beans per foot a row is the easy way to do beans. But I love this measuring wheel method in corn. If you've never done it that way, try it. It is a lot more accurate than stepping off 17 feet 5 inches. And it is a lot easier to do this 2 or 3 places in the field than it is to do 17 feet 5 inches, probably at least 10 places in the field, which is what you would need to do to have a pretty good idea. The thing I like about going 50, 60, 70 feet a row, you get good spots, you get bad spots, you get gaps, you get places where you don't have gaps. You just get a better feel for the field. If you count 100 to 200 plants down the row, 2 or 3 places in a field, you're going to get a pretty good average for population on corn. And if you're going, I'm going to say less than 60 feet to get 100 plants, that's almost always a leavable stand, in my opinion. That's going to, 60 feet is going to put you real close to 30,000 in a 30-inch row, going 60 feet to get 100 plants. And that's, less than you planted, but that's enough that a replant is not going to give you more yield potential. So let's talk a little bit about what's a good plant. So when you're out there looking, especially at a stand that has struggled, what are you going to find? You're going to find gaps and skips. You're going to find runts, and you're going to find what I call malformed, aka screwed up plants. So the runts were slow ones, slow emergers that came up late. The gaps and skips, if you dig down there, you'll find that seed. It either rotted in the ground, maybe it's got a root but no shoot, maybe it leafed out underground. That plant's gone. And then the malformed plants, and these are the ones that are probably, these two here are the ones that are hardest to count because you don't know whether you should count them or not. Because you've all heard if it's 2 leaves behind, it's what? You probably think that means weed. I'm going to tell you that it's not what that means. That has been misconstrued, but we'll talk about that. So these malformed or screwed up plants, these are the ones that almost leafed out underground. They actually, the coleoptile started to split open, started to leaf out underground, but it was close enough to the surface, or it found a crack, or somehow it was, when it leafed out underground, it was still able to break through, but it's kind of twisted up. You wonder if it's ever going to mount to anything. Most of those plants, if they get out, they will get themselves righted eventually, and they will become a productive member of society. And if you want to prove that to yourself, take some garden stakes or plot marker stakes and put stakes beside some of those screwed up plants. Take your phone, take a picture of the stake next to that plant, and then you can track that plant through the growing season and see what kind of ear develops on that plant. I've got a dealer that I work with. We just did some of that in the field a few days ago, marked some plants, and we're going to use those plants at his field days later this year to see what kind of ear development we get. Because he and his dad were having an argument over, well, do you count those or do you not? His dad thought they were weeds. I think most of them are going to have an ear. I think a lot of them will have an ear that's probably just as good as the plant that's not screwed up next to it. But if you don't put a permanent marker by that plant to identify that, okay, this was the plant that was all twisted up when it was V2, you're not going to know, come harvest time, what's there. So let's talk about this 2-leaf thing. So what the university research says is that when a plant is 2 leaves behind, that's where measurable yield loss occurs. Measurable yield loss just means it's enough yield loss that they can measure it. And university researchers want everything to be statistically significant. So to a farmer, a bushel's a bushel, right? To a university researcher, a bushel, if your LSD is 20, is nothing. So at 2 leaves behind, that's where statistically measurable yield loss is occurring. So statistically measurable yield loss is significant. So it's nothing to scoff at, but it doesn't mean it's going to be a barren plant. So this idea that 2 leaves behind means it's a weed, it's not a weed when it's 2 leaves behind. And how much yield loss occurs from being behind somewhat fluctuates based on population as well. So if you've got 52,000 plants out there because you're trying to win the NCGA yield contest and you've got the potential to raise 500 bushel corn, you've got a lot of competition between plants. And those plants that are delayed are going to get outcompeted. And they're not going to have the ear on them that you would like to see. If you've got a marginal stand of 28,000 plants and each plant's got a little more room, those small plants are probably going to contribute more to yield than a small plant does at a really high seeding rate. So seeding rate and competition influences the effect of this as well. So what I would say is I count the runts, but if they're more than 2 leaves behind, I count them at, say, maybe 50%. So let's say if in my count, I was counting 100 plants, if I had 10 runts, I'll count 10 runts as 5 plants. So I'll give them some credit for being there. I somewhat do the same thing with the malformed plants. If the plant's a little bit malformed, I count it as a full-fledged plant. If it's really gnarled up, really twisted up, really sad looking, and I think there's a chance that it may not make it, I'll probably count half of those that look that ugly. And I think that's being conservative. The other thing you can do to be conservative is you can penalize yourself for the gaps and skips. So corn plants can compensate, but you can't compensate for a 2 or 3 or 4 foot gap where there's nothing. And so that's the other thing that's in these guides is there's penalties that you can assess to your yield potential based on skips and gaps. So you're never going to have a uniform crappy stand. The nature of a crappy stand is it's going to be non-uniform. So you can always penalize your yield potential of that old stand a little bit for the gaps and skips and unevenness that's there. That brings up another question that I like as a theoretical question. So if corn struggles, does it lose yield potential? And that's a little bit of a trick question because I'm going to say not necessarily, But in the real world, typically that's what happens. So if, and this is why it happens, if it took 4 weeks for corn to struggle out of the ground, but you ended up with an even and full stand, I personally believe that crop has just as much yield potential as corn that comes up in 5 days. But the reason why this is a big but is if it takes 4 weeks to struggle out of the ground, it's going to get uneven. You're going to have skips and gaps. You're not going to have a full stand, and it's not going to be even. So it's not necessarily the stress of the struggle that is costing that plant yield potential, because genetically, it's still the same plant, whether it comes up in 4 weeks or 4 days. And what's going to determine that plant's yield potential, genetics and how much sunlight it can capture, how much water and nutrients it can take up. That stuff's all going to happen, throughout the rest of the growing season. I think what causes corn to lose yield potential when it struggles is, by default, you don't get all the plants. You don't have as good a stand. It's not an even stand. My phone's vibrating. And that's where the majority of your yield loss is coming from. So does corn that struggles lose yield potential? Yes. But I don't necessarily believe it's just because it struggled. It's because of the consequences or the results of the struggling is what's causing the yield loss. So Adam had some suggestions for topics. We talked about, let's talk a little bit about these malformed seeds in corn. So these plants that almost leafed out underground, if they completely leaf out underground, it's probably a dead plant, because when that plant is pushing up through the soil, when that spike's pushing up through the soil, as soon as it starts to split open, and as soon as it starts to leaf out, it doesn't have any push, and it just gets all accordioned up, and because it's like trying to push a rope, basically, and you can't do that. So if it leaves out underground, it's probably not going to emerge unless it did it really close to the surface, and then sometimes they'll break through. Or if there's a crack there, maybe and if the crack's there, that might be why they leafed out underground in the first place, because as soon as that coleoptile tip on that spike sees sunlight, it thinks it's up. So if it breaks out into a crack, some of the worst leaf out underground I've ever seen is if you've got seed that's an inch deep that comes into a crack, leafs out because it gets daylight, and then you get a rain and it silts that crack back together. None of that corn's coming up because it's all leafed out underground and just been covered up by that silt. But these plants that are malformed, a lot of times if you dig them up, you won't find that they grew, they didn't know which way was up, basically. So if you dig up those plants, you're going to find the seed. If it's a healthy plant, you're going to find a root system. And then in many cases, you're going to find a coleoptile that maybe did one of these. Or I've even seen in severe cases where it does like a 360 around the seed and then up. Or maybe it grows down for a ways and then sideways and then eventually up. And what happens to these plants is all this time they're spending and all this energy they're wasting growing every which way but up is going to delay the emergence of that plant, sap the strength of that plant, and increase the likelihood that it's going to leaf out underground. So when you're looking at runts or plants that are malformed and leafed out underground or partially leafed out underground, as you're digging, look for those telltale signs in that mesocotyl of the fact that it wasn't growing straight. That can be caused by lots of things: cold injury, chilling injury, stress, weak seed, abnormal seeds. Not every seed in the bag is of equal quality. Even in high quality seed, there's a range of quality of seed within the bag. And it is the weaker seeds, the poor quality seeds that are going to be more likely to do this. And cold weather stress, chilling injury, things that damage that seed are going to more likely, basically I describe it as a hormonal imbalance. There's systems in the plant called geotropism that tells that plant it's growing against gravity, basically. So that's how it knows which way's up. And if hormonally the plant is imbalanced, or it's stressed or damaged or injured, it literally doesn't know which direction it's growing. And by the time it figures out which direction it's growing and gets headed straight up again, if it's wasted 2 or 3 days of growth and wasted the energy of 2 or 3 days worth of growth, it may not have enough energy left to get up. If it does, it's going to be delayed, and it's gone through a lot of stress at that point. And the combination of the stress and the delay and the unevenness is that plant's probably not going to have as good a year on it. Okay, one of Adam's items he had on my list was herbicide injury in soybeans. When you've got soybeans that lay in cold, wet soil in the presence of pre-emergent chemistry, it's not uncommon to see some injury with a lot of our soybean pre-emergent products. That can be burning, that can be stunting, that can be chlorosis. It kind of depends on the chemistry. Typically, there's not a yield impact to any of that. Soybeans are extremely tolerant of early season injury. There are people that have been soybean yield contest winners and gurus of soybean yield that injure soybeans intentionally because they think it makes them yield more. So typically, some stress from a pre-emergent soybean herbicide is not going to impact the yield potential of your soybeans. Now, it can be frustrating, especially if you're planting beans early and your idea, your goal of early planted soybeans was to get them to canopy quicker and get them to flower earlier. So you don't want to do anything to slow them down, because that somewhat defeats the purpose. So it can be frustrating. Occasionally, it can contribute to a replant situation. There are a lot of fields every year that get replanted and someone blames a herbicide on the fact that the field needed replanted. I would say in the vast majority of cases, the herbicide could have made the situation worse. But if the field truly needed replanted, it probably would have still needed replanted even without the herbicide. But you can have an interaction between environmental conditions and herbicides that are not beneficial to stand establishment. But oftentimes, it might have needed replanted worse because of the herbicide injury interacting with the environment, but it would have still needed replanted even if the herbicide hadn't been a factor. So we need our pre-emergent soybean herbicides. We need the weed control that they offer. We need to expect occasionally to see some crop response. There are ways you can try to minimize the impact of that response. Generally speaking, the fewer days that soybean lays in that treated soil, the less likely you are to have crop response. So if you can, plant your beans and put your herbicide over the top just a few days before the soybeans come up, that's going to minimize the exposure of that plant. Worst case scenario is you plant your soybeans early, you apply your herbicide early, and then it gets cold and wet, and that soybean lays in that cold, wet soil, imbibing that herbicide, taking that herbicide in with the water, being exposed to that herbicide. As that hypocotyl is trying to grow up through the soil, it's just being exposed to herbicide. And a lot of our herbicides, the trial work that was done to show that they've got adequate crop safety, that wasn't done in March. That wasn't done in the first half of April. It wasn't done in a 42-degree wet, cold, no-till timber soil. That's not the environment that a lot of those trials were done in. So we have observed that as we push planting dates earlier, we are increasing the stress from some of these herbicides, because we are doing things with them, with soybeans, that we weren't doing when those products were developed. So that's part of the reason that we, in some cases, see more injury than we would have expected, because we're doing things differently than we were when those products were initially developed. And we do have some growers that have opted to plant soybeans with no herbicide in the ground and then try to spray later. We've had some go so far as to say, well, I want to use a residual product that has post-emergence flexibility so that I can let my beans get up before I have any herbicide in the soil. That can be beneficial to the soybean. It can also be detrimental to weed control. So just be aware that there are trade-offs, and the hotter the herbicide is and the better it's working, usually the better the weed control is as well. So if you've got a situation where you've got a lot of crop injury, that means you got a very active herbicide that's doing what it's supposed to do. It's inhibiting the growth of dicot plants. In this case, the dicot that it's inhibiting happens to be your soybeans. Okay, this kind of goes into the next topic here. If you did plant beans, and I've got some of this going on my farm, if you were planning on using a residual program that had to be on before soybeans emerged, and because of a rain delay or too windy to spray or whatever reason you weren't able to get that herbicide application on, you may have a situation where your beans are now up and you can no longer use the program that you were planning to use. There are programs that you can use, there are products that you can use, but just be aware, if you were planning on a pre-emergent application and your plan pre becomes an early post because the soybeans are up, you may have to change that mix up and use some products that have the flexibility to be applied early post on soybeans. Talk a little bit about growth staging. Talk about corn first. So corn, we do collars. So where the leaf hooks on to the stalk, there's a collar that forms there. When you can see that collar, that's when you count that leaf. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to say we're counting leaves. We are counting leaves, but we're counting fully developed leaves. There are always leaves on a seedling corn plant that are not fully developed. So you can't just count leaves, because if you count all the leaves, you are greatly overstaging your corn, which is better than understaging your corn. So if you call it 6 leaf and it's actually 4, yeah, you're wrong, but you're safe from a herbicide label standpoint. The dangerous thing is, as corn gets bigger, some of these lower leaves, fall off, disappear, disintegrate. By the time corn's V6, you probably can't still find the first leaf in a lot of cases. And so then the opposite occurs. If the first 2 leaves are gone and you count collars and you say, oh, I got 6 leaf corn here, but if the first 2 are gone, you can't see them, you've actually got 8 leaf corn there. There's a lot of products you don't want to be spraying on 8 leaf corn. So as the corn gets bigger, we need to know how to split the stalk and count nodes at the base of the stalk. Or another way you can do it, if you've got an individual plant that you want to watch and stage the field, all you got to do, this is a little trick for you, take a permanent marker, not a dry erase board marker, but an actual good permanent Sharpie marker, and write a 6 on the 6th leaf when you can still count the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th leaf, and so you know that that's the 6th leaf. And then when you come back and the first 3 leaves are gone, find the one with the 6 on it and start counting from there. So that's an easy way to do it if you're tracking an individual plant. Now you're not going to put a 6 on the 6th leaf of every corn plant you've got. And there are ways that you can split the stalk through the base, through the crown, and count the nodes. You can't really do that very effectively until after V6, but up until V6, you should be able to find that first true leaf, which brings up another thing. So how do you tell the first true leaf? The first true leaf has more of a blunt tip. kind of a thumb look to it. This one counts. So I hear people all the time say, oh, you don't count the first leaf. Yes, you do. So that first, you find the one with the blunt tip. That's the first leaf. So that's always one. That leaf's going to be there at least up until V4, V5. Usually sometimes you still find it at V6. You get past V6, that first leaf's going to be gone. Once the first leaf's gone, they all look the same. You can't tell if you can't find the first one. You don't know if the first one you've got is the second, the third, the fourth, or the fifth, or what it is. You just know it's not the first. So there's a lot of post-emergence herbicides that have all post-emergence herbicides have label restrictions. Some, might be V3. Some might be V5. A lot of them are V6. Few of them are V8. Every post-emergence herbicide you apply on corn has a growth stage restriction. And the reason those growth stage restrictions are there is to keep you from dinging the yield of your crop. So, if a herbicide says don't apply after V3, you don't want to put it on V5 corn. If it says don't apply after V6, you don't want to put it on V8 corn. And so that's why it's important to know, what growth stage you're at, because if you exceed those growth stage restrictions, there's a greater potential for crop injury. A little bit of an insect update. We have had reports of cutworms. We had a lot of fields that got really green this year. In some areas, good year for fall burn down. We'll talk a lot more about fall burn down later in the year when it's when you can do something about it, rather than this time of year when everybody is wishing they had done something about it. So we'll talk more about fall burn down. But cutworm moths are attracted to green fields. So it could be green because it's chickweed, henbit, and pennycress. It could be green because it's got a cover crop. It could be green for whatever reason. But those moths tend to migrate to those green fields. So cutworms it's not necessarily just no-till fields. There's a lot of fields that get worked in the spring that, some of our conventional till folks actually need a fall burn down worse than some of the no-tillers do. No-tillers have been a little more accustomed to fall burn down because they're doing a burn down anyway. If you're planning on working your field in the spring, you probably don't think you need a fall burn down. But when your field cultivator is balling up with chickweed and you're leaving muskrat huts all over your farm because your field cultivator wouldn't get through the winter annuals that you had, that's a situation where even as a tillage guy, a fall burn down would be very, very beneficial. But cutworms, you just need to scout and treat for those. They are relatively easy to control. They are relatively economical to control. But if you don't find them in time, they can obviously do a lot of damage. Some traits have activity on cutworms. So our Tricepta trait has pretty good activity on cutworms. Some of the other traits have suppression, but I wouldn't rely on suppression to control cutworms. The high rate seed treatments have activity on cutworms as well. So the 500 rate of Poncho has some suppression of cutworms. I wouldn't rely on that for control. There are people that put out, broadcast pre-emergent broadcast insecticide with their pre on corn as kind of a preventative strategy for cutworm. That can be very effective. You don't necessarily just want to do it willy-nilly just in case, but that's another option that's out there. There are people that have used granular insecticides to control cutworms. That's not really my recommendation. They're more of a scout and treat for them if you got them kind of pest. You're never going to have them on every acre. They're going to be concentrated in spots, but just something to keep an eye out for. A lot of bean leaf beetle activity as well. So if you planted treated soybeans and that bean was treated with a neonicotinoid insecticide, so a neonic insecticide, so like a Poncho or a Gaucho or Cruiser or those type of products, they have pretty good activity on bean leaf beetle. We like Gaucho in our Acceleron mixes because it has the best bean leaf beetle activity, but rates can vary. So products are different. Like Gaucho is better than Poncho on bean leaf beetle, and a lot of gaucho is better than a little bit of gaucho. So depending on the rate and the product, you can see different levels of protection. But if you've got soybeans planted early that do not have an insecticide seed treatment, they're going to look like Swiss cheese. And if you've got soybeans with an insecticide treatment that still look like Swiss cheese, I'm going to say that's probably a low rate of a product that's not as good on bean leaf beetle as some of the products that are out there. So just something to keep an eye on.
Well,
all right. I think we're
about at the end of the time, but
About
a
at
quiet
the-
group today. Of course,
Yep.
you know, everybody's probably out and about
Yep.
working on
Yep.
something this morning, I'm sure. So our
I'm-
next Ask the Agronomist is on 6/2. So we'll be turning the calendar as far as the month is concerned.
Yep. Hopefully everybody's done planting by then. Been a lot of planting progress made. A lot of fields look really nice. I think last week was a big week for a lot of areas to get caught up. You know, we're still behind normal, but we're not as much behind normal as we were 2 weeks ago. And we got a late start. We were very late getting to 50% planted, but you know, we're probably going to be to 100% planted. Probably not a whole lot different than a typical year with the progress that we've been able to make the past week or 10 days. So everybody stay safe and hopefully get your planting wrapped up soon. I hope I get mine wrapped up soon, and then I start to assess what needs to be replanted after the 4.5-inch rainstorm last week. So everybody stay safe, and we'll be back with you in 2 weeks. Thanks.